Hello everyone, welcome to Keen Ian. Now the previous installment of this series wasn't exactly a runaway success, but despite that I've actually been joined in this video by a fan. So over in the distance you might be able to spot the summit of Mount Solo Beatles. Yes, we're up to the final 13 this time around. And the more eagle-eyed amongst you may note that I'm not using post-it notes, this time around. The main reason for that is because this is a reshoot. I've had to reshoot this video. I just wasn't happy with the previous one, but between the previous shoot and this shoot, I've thrown away all the post-it notes that I was using. I don't have any more, so we're going to have to go this one without post-it notes. So it's not going to pan out exactly as I was hoping with all the little bits of stats and things like that. But these albums aren't exactly super obscure or anything like that. But one thing I would like to note, though, and on the theme of obscurity and all that kind of thing, is that one of the things that I like about these albums is that on the one hand, they are kind of a bit overexposed to a certain extent, just due to their relation to the Beatles. They are part of the Beatles, output and that kind of thing, just because, they're like Paul and John and all that kind of stuff. So uh, they have this leaning towards being, overexposed just through association, if nothing else. But then on the other hand, they are quite obscure, to a certain extent. They have at the very least obscure material within them. For instance, if you were to play some of the material, some of the more obscure material to like a general audience, I pretty much guarantee a lot of them wouldn't really, they'd know it's a Paul McCartney song or a John Lennon song and that kind of thing. They'd recognize the voice, but they might not know the song itself. They might not know the lyrics. They might never have heard it before. So yeah, I think there's genuine obscurity to this, a weird sort of dynamic of obscurity and overexposure to a certain extent. So that's one of the things I honestly quite like about these albums. But anyway, let's tackle this mountain once and for all. We'll get to the summit. First, we must start at number 13, and I've decided to go for a Wings album. This is At the Speed of Sound, and yeah, number 13 for me. And this came out, I believe, it was 1976. So I had the post-it notes; it would help me. So I'll kind of just ignore the dates. You know the dates of these albums, quite honestly. And if you don't, you can just look her up very easily. So anyway. Number 13, At the Speed of Sound. Now, when I first heard this album, I wouldn't say I was underwhelmed or anything or disappointed. I think I just felt like maybe this album was perhaps missold to me to a certain extent because I felt like, it's called Wings at the Speed of Sound. It's sort of exciting, fast-paced title, and it really isn't a super fast paced, it's not like a rocking album, certainly not like a thrash metal. Of course, you're not expecting a thrash metal album from Wings, but it's not a super fast, sort of heavy rocking album by any means. It's actually quite a slow, a slower tempo, more sort of almost like a self-reflective album. In fact, one of my favorite songs on here is called "Must Do Something About It," which is a very, it's a very self-reflective song. So yeah, it's and if anything, it sets the pace of this album with the first track, Let 'Em In, which has got this almost like ticking clock sort of tempo to it. And yeah, it's not really this super fast album, but over time, this album has grown on me. I really do quite like it, and I think it's a solid release, and it's an interesting project this as well because this is the album where all the members of Wings kind of get a chance to shine, really. Even Linda's got her own song on this one. And this was really something that, Wings albums, perhaps in a different universe, could have turned into. This is what they could have, this could have been the norm sort of thing if the Wings project had maybe changed and maybe had been a little bit more successful to a certain extent in the sense that if all the members had been retained from day one and they stuck it out, but it kind of wasn't to be as history played out. So yeah, this is kind of like a bit of a one-off in that regard in the Wings back catalogue. It's an album where Paul kind of takes a somewhat of a backseat to a certain extent, although he's very much still front and center, and that would have been the case regardless. Going through with Wings, he's the main guy. He's the biggest monkey in the tree sort of thing, and everyone else would have been playing second fiddle to it. But I think this would have set the standard more. You know, this type of album maybe would have set the standard perhaps more if if the project would have been maybe if it would have played out a bit differently and that kind of thing. So yeah, very good album, but a bit of an interesting departure from what you typically get with a Wings album, and it's well worth checking out. It's nothing groundbreaking or anything like that, but I do quite like it. So we'll move on to a CD against a Paul McCartney related one. This is Paul McCartney's Memory Almost Full, a more recent album. This is definitely an album where you can kind of there's this sort of uh, feeling amongst quite a lot of people that Paul McCartney hasn't released any good material since Insert Date Here. Some people, I've heard one person a while back who said that Paul hasn't put anything good out since the 1960s, which is kind of crazy, really. You kind of got to ignore all his over 50 years of material, not find anything good about it apparently. But yeah, this is much more recent album. I really was keen to put something more recent in here, if I could possibly do it. And this was, I felt like the more the kind of the best option really for it. I think this is a very good solid album. With their Wings at the Speed of Sound, I was talking about a self-reflective album. Again, it's kind of got that feeling with this one as well. It's almost like it's got the armchair there. It's almost like Paul. He's sitting there, in a comfy seat with Paul in front of a fire, and he's kind of, not to the extent of every song on this album by any means, but he's kind of going through a scrapbook of history, and he's kind of going through bits and pieces of his past. And he goes down some dark areas as well, which I think is pretty interesting. And it is a bit somewhat autobiographical. Some of the songs on here, I think that's quite interesting. It's very solid, well put together, more recent, Paul McCartney album, well worth checking out. And yeah, certainly the best Paul McCartney album post the year 2000, post the millennium. So yeah, I particularly like it. The only thing about this album, which I'm not too keen on, is the mastering. Really, they really dropped the ball with the mastering. If I was to nominate, one album from a former Beatle to be remastered, maybe even remixed, perhaps it would be this one. It's the one thing that kind of lets it down. The mastering's just not particularly all that good, but a very fine project and a bit of a surprise as well. I wasn't expecting it to be as good as it is, particularly as the copy I've got as a freebie and that kind of thing. It was given away free with newspapers and all sorts. So yeah, I had very kind of, I wouldn't say low expectations, but the expectations weren't particularly high, and it certainly surpassed them. And it's definitely an album that's well worth checking out. I think it's a bit of an underrated album as well. I think it's an album that will get reassessed as time goes on, I'm sure. So anyway, we'll move on to another Paul McCartney album. This is Flaming Pie. I believe this came out in '97, and again, this is another opportunity if someone claims that Paul hasn't released an album in donkey's years. Although this is it's not exactly last week, 1997. But if somebody says, "Oh, he hasn't released an album since the '70s" or anything like that, just highlight this and highlight Memory Almost Full and that kind of thing. Very, very solid album. Really, really good. Good throughout. This is easily, I'd say, I'd kind of pour a fairly large sum on the line to suggest that this is the best album by a former Beatle from the 1990s. Although there's Ringo Starr albums which I haven't listened to, quite honestly, and but I doubt very much that they're as good as this, quite honestly. But you never know. But yeah, this is really good, and I feel like this album was Paul kind of building up, to this. I feel like Flowers in the Dirt, followed by Off the Ground, and this is like the follow up to those albums. They'll kind of have this similar sort of feel to them to a certain extent, and I feel like they were kind of laying the foundations for this. This is like the main event. They were leading up to this, and it was really worth it. That build up. And this is the superior album. This is the sort of the castle on top of the foundations of two previous pretty good albums. Those albums I've just mentioned are very good, but this is like sublime, really, really, really good. And again, I was happy to kind of put this up, higher up the charts, an album from more recent times rather than something from the '70s or something like that. Although, as I say that, actually going to start with the next album, with something from pretty much the very tail end of the Beatles, and I've gone for, again, it's a McCartney album, and you can kind of guess what it is. It is the self-titled McCartney album. 1970, this came out, marks the end of the Beatles, effectively, this album. And on the one hand, in terms of music, this probably should be going a little bit lower down because it's not a particularly outstanding album musically, although I do like the music on this album, I always have. Arguably, it's perhaps not, it's punching above its weight a little bit, but I think in terms of the impact and the sort of significance this album has, I think it kind of deserves to go up a bit higher. And also, as well, this is an album where I feel like, Paul kind of, he sort of creates an album in which he sort of makes music, which sort of give you an insight really into what he was going through at the time. There's a lot of anxiety in this album. There's a lot of sort of fear. There's a lot of sort of worry and doubts about whether he's doing the right thing. There's a lot of dark negativity surrounding this album. I think he really kind of comes across on this album. There is some optimism and that kind of thing as well. But yeah, I think there is a lot of doubt in this. And I think that he kind of really, shows that, really highlights that with this album. And it's almost like an insight into his psyche at the time, which I think is really, really interesting. Just as an album, as a piece of music goes, I think that's very, very interesting. It's a really interesting insight into how what he was going through, his psyche, and all the things that he was going on in his mind at that point in time. At the very tail end of the Beatles. And yeah, I find it a very interesting listen. I really do. The only downside to this album really is it's got a very thin veneer of music on it. Really, for an album, it's kind of pushing things a little bit. There's certain sections, for instance, which sound like it's almost like a band rehearsing to a certain extent. It's got like electric guitars and things, and this sort of rocky sort of sort of band rehearsal, band warming up sort of feel, and it just feels like it's you could argue it doesn't necessarily feel like it's finished, shall we say, to a certain extent. But it's got some really amazing stuff on it. It's got Maybe I'm Amazed, of course, which is one of Paul's all-time greats. It's a song that wouldn't have been out of place on Abbey Road, there wouldn't have been out of place on Let It Be. You've got other good stuff on here, but the fact that it's got Junk and then it's got sing along Junk as well, kind of makes you feel like there's perhaps not enough material on this album. But it's still a significant album. I think it's still well worth listening to. I still like listening to it. It's not like it's a chore to listen to or anything like that. But it's although at points maybe it kind of is, but not to. It's not an album which kind of tests my patience, over a certain level of tolerance. So it's still an album that I enjoy listening to, and it's got some real diamonds on it as well. Some really good stuff on it. Perhaps not enough to make it as an all-time great. I think it's just maybe a bit behind that. I think the sort of the band rehearsal sections, for instance, that kind of thing, weigh it down a little bit. But still, I do like it, and I think it does have significance. So I've decided to pour it fairly high up in the chart. So we'll move on to another Paul album, another Wings album. This is Red Rose Speedway. This one's, I guess, somewhat controversial to put this, I guess, to a certain extent, where I have, it is above, Flaming Pie and things like that. And McCartney's album, you've seen the albums which this is ahead of, so it's perhaps a little bit. And I was kind of in two minds about maybe putting her a bit lower, but I feel like this is really the next step in Wings. This is the next step in their evolution, and I think they were kind of really heading somewhere at this point in time. I think this is a really significant time for Paul McCartney and for Wings. I think they're really going somewhere at this point. And they're starting to put together particularly good material. I feel like this album is it's got some really good stuff on it. It's got the My Love song on it, which is it's got to be one of Paul's best sort of ballads. It's up there with Yesterday. It's up there with we've just seen McCartney's album. Maybe I'm Amazed, and it's kind of up there with the best of the best of McCartney's ballads. So it's got some really good stuff on it. It's kind of like Wings. McCartney are kind of going somewhere with this. I just feel like this album towards the end it kind of runs out of steam a little bit, but overall it's still a very it's still a solid album. It's kind of mostly goes over the line of being a particularly good album, but it just feels like it just needed a little bit extra to be something truly special, and I guess that's why I put it as it could have gone a lot higher with just a little bit more panache to it, a little bit more going for it. This could have been maybe even in the top five and that kind of thing, which just kind of misses out. It just kind of runs out of steam a little bit towards the end. So we'll move on to, I guess, again, another somewhat controversial decision to a certain extent. This is Ram. And I think with this album, a lot of people would have put it necessarily a bit higher. I've always been of the opinion of this album, really, that when it came out, the critics weren't necessarily blown away by it. In fact, the critics were. I feel like the critics at this point in time, the early '70s, they kind of still hadn't given, sort of forgiven Paul for announcing the breakup of the Beatles, and I think there was still some resentments that they were carrying at this time, and they just didn't really give him a fair shot. I feel like at this time they had grudges against him. It's kind of fair to say. And the critics weren't kind on this album at all. And I think over time this album it's kind of been reevaluated now. A lot of critics actually saying this is one of Paul's best, and many of them actually saying it is his best. And there's many people out there have said this. I think this is an album that's very over the decades has gone from being underrated to a certain extent to being very much overrated. I've always liked this album. Always thought it was a pretty good album. Of course, wouldn't have it at this point in the series if I thought it was bad. Of course, but I've always felt like this is a little bit overrated and a little bit not quite up there amongst the best, the very very best, the top three or anything like that. I've never felt like this is like a top album. Well, it's certainly not the best, shall we put it that way. And one of the things I don't really kind of like about this album, quite honestly, the thing that kind of really drags it down for me, you've got this really very sort of childish sort of album design, an album cover design, which is a Paul McCartney creation. He created this himself. I think he was with his kids and things when he created this, and it's got a very sort of juvenile feel to it, which on the one hand it's got a bit of charm to it, certainly, but on the other hand I feel like it grates a little bit. It becomes a little bit annoying, this album. It becomes a bit grating. It becomes it's like being in a kid's birthday party. It's all fun until it kind of gets a bit annoying, and the screeches and the screams and all the whistles and all the rest of it kind of get on your nerves a little bit. And I feel like this album it kind of just drives me around the bend a little bit. You got all this kind of kookiness to it, kind of going on, and it just wears me out a little bit. It kind of rubs me up the wrong way at points. But despite that, it's still a very solid album. It's got some really good stuff on it. It's very well put together and everything. It deserves to be higher up in this chart, just through to the quality. There is some definite quality. I just feel like for me personally, it kind of just gets a little bit annoying in places, which is why I put it where I have, not any higher. So we'll move on. Again, we've got another Wings album, and this time around it's Venus and Mars. Not a great deal to say about this one, quite honestly, besides the fact that it's a really, really solid, well put together album. This is Wings, Paul McCartney in the 1970s playing it kind of as safe as he ever played it, really, with just a lot of quality to it as well. It's kind of like if you want a good quality rock and pop album, which is really fun, has got some quality throughout. There's not a bad moment really on this album. Lots of fun to listen to. lots to enjoy. It's kind of like a crowd pleasing album, very much so. It's something that was kind of destined to be a hit. It was a hit album, and it's well regarded, and it deserves to be. But it doesn't really do anything else. It's just a very good sort of 1970s rock pop album, which kind of it ticks all the boxes, but doesn't really do anything extra. I don't think this is an album which is anything necessarily special, beside the fact that it does everything kind of so well and so sort of confidently, and it's sort of Paul in very confident mood, and he sort of swaggers about really with this album, kind of on top of the world. Really, kind of didn't really have a lot to prove at this point, and it's just a lot of fun, very well put together, solid, enjoyable 1970s pop rock album. And that's kind of it, really. So we'll move on to something by not Paul McCartney but John Lennon. Finally, a break from Paul. This is Walls and Bridges. Sorry, I'm just making sure it's all together. It's one of those funny album covers, kind of all opens up all over the place. Mine's a bit damaged as well, but it seems to be okay. So yeah, I think this is an album that I think just misses out on being, the best, the best of the best, really, from John. I think this album is due reassessment. I'd imagine next year, with this reaching it, I believe this is going to reach its 50th anniversary next year. It's probably going to get reevaluated in the same way that Mind Games has been reevaluated. This year it's kind of been pushed forward as it's something to kind of take note of. It's been given this big grand sort of box sets and things like that, and I think a lot of younger people, younger audiences kind of taken on board for the first time. Older people, I guess, have maybe reevaluated it. I think the same is going to happen to this, but to a greater extent, because I think this is a much better album than Mind Games. This is really good, really good. This is like John's swan song. I feel like this is the last best thing that he did before he was killed, and it's really good. It's certainly better, as I said, than the Mind Games. It's way better than Sometime New York City. This is light years ahead. And one of the interesting things with this album that separates it from all the other John Lennon albums is the production. The production of this is kind of very big. It's got very big production, which is something you didn't really get generally with John Lennon solo material. It's kind of very restrained. It was kind of very minimal sort of production. This is very big, very sort of full on, and you even get a sort of somewhat instrumental track. There's a song called Beef Jerky, which does have lyrics in it, but it's kind of splitting hairs, quite honestly. It's mostly an instrumental track, and he kind of, John kind of, I guess, wallows in the the full band, which he has kind of access to, and I guess he was loving every minute of it to a certain extent. And I think this is, this recording way of recording an album, he would have obviously probably, well, almost certainly would have revisited if time would have allowed him to do it, but it was unfortunate. This is sort of like the only instance really where we have John post Beatles really kind of having this big backing band with him, and it kind of makes this album a bit extra special. Not a great album, I'd say. I think it's within touching distance, like I've mentioned. It's within touching distance, but really good. And like I said, the best thing that John put out before his death, in the mid 1970s. So we'll move on to an album that many people would put number one. It's George Harrison's All Things Must Pass from 1970. I've decided to put this, not number one effectively. The thing is with this album, I've never really felt like this is, anywhere near being my favourite album from a former Beatle, or certainly not my favourite George Harrison album. I've always felt like it's a very good album, of course. I've never felt like it's not a good album, but I've never really subscribed to the idea that it's the best of the best. It appears so many times as number one. So many other people's charts. I kind of disagree. I don't feel like it is the best. I think it's got too many limitations. First of all, it's it's 3 records, and it doesn't need to be 3 records. It's overkill, complete overkill. Third disc, especially, the jam sessions, they could have quite honestly not been there. Just weighs the album down. And I'm not one of these people who say that double albums should be reined in a little bit and turned into one disc. And I've never had that sort of feel at all. I've never really felt like that. I've never, for instance, the White Album, never subscribed to the idea it should be one record and that kind of thing. I disagree with that completely. I think it's perfect as it is, but with this, I think it really would have been a better album if you trim it down and just release one record, two at the most. I think two was like pushing it, quite honestly. The fact that they went for a third one was absolutely overkill. Also, the production of this album, at least this first issue that I've got, I don't know if they've fixed it with reissues and remixes and that kind of thing. But this issue, it just sounds bad, really. The mastering and everything is just disappointing, to say the least. Apparently, well, it's crap. It's crap, honestly, the mastering of this album. It's so disappointing. And even George Harrison himself didn't like the way this album was kind of, the final treatment this album had. He was kind of a bit devastated, quite honestly. Phil Spector came along and kind of just ruined the sound of this album completely. George went through a lot to record this album. He put a lot of work and effort, George, into making it sound as good as it possibly could. He was very much a perfectionist when it comes to this type of thing, and he spent a lot of time and effort to make it sound as great as it could. And then Phil Spector came along and just flattened her out, and it's just such a flat sounding album. It's so disappointing. It almost sounds like a bootleg to a certain extent. And yeah, it's all thanks to Phil Spector. And yeah, you sort of just dulled this album. And I think certain sections of this album, even on the main event, ignoring the the extra disc, the jam disc, it kind of just it just feels a bit heavy and a bit slow at times. This album, it kind of needed tightening up a little bit and playing around with, and I think it just needed something doing to it. You get rid of Phil Spector, turn it into one record, change the sequencing maybe a little bit. Still got some really, really good stuff on it. I really do like it, but I just feel like it's got too many flaws to weigh it down. I'm going to put it down now because it's actually very heavy. It's a full record set, so it's weighing me muscles a little bit. So it's an album that I like, but I've never subscribed to the idea of it being the best of the best. So we'll kind of leave it at that. So I'll move her on back to a John album. We've gone for Plastic Ono Band. An outstanding album from John. This is, if somebody was to suggest, for instance, that this is the best solo Beatles album, unlike Ram or All Things Must Pass, I would have no real problem with that. Quite honestly, I'd say fair enough. If you think this is the best, I'd have no objection to it whatsoever. Quite honestly, I'd just let them have their their time. I wouldn't cut in like I would with something, with All Things Must Pass or Ram and that kind of thing. I couldn't hold back, quite honestly. But with this, I'd just let them have it, because this is a really, really good album. This is, it's brutally savage album. It's sort of John really kind of lays her out, and he kind of pummels you with his emotions. This is an album not for the faint of heart. It's got this really kind of sweet album cover, and it's almost like dreamy. But yeah, this album doesn't pull any punches whatsoever. It's an emotional sort of attack, quite honestly, musical attack, and it's great. It's got one song on here which I really do think is a great piece of proto-punk from the very early days of 1970. Can't get more proto-punk than that. Is the song "Well, Well, Well," which just pummels you, really. I believe is it Ringo on drums for that track, but it's just relentless the way it goes. If anyone suggests Ringo's a bad drummer, just play "Well, Well, Well." It's unbelievable when you get John sort of screaming down the microphone, and it's fantastic. So yeah, a really good album, but it is an album where I do have to be in the right frame of mind to enjoy. It's a lot of things which is something that I've heard a lot of people say about it. You've got to be in the right frame of mind. it's not something you can just play whenever because it is kind of brutal and it doesn't pull any punches and everything. But when you are in the right frame of mind, when you are ready for it, it's really really good. And I love the strip back production as well. You know, it's kind of very open and very sort of raw, and it's just fantastic. So I'll move on to another album by John. I've gone for Imagine. Wimped out a little bit with this one. I've gone for Imagine over Plastic Ono Band, which a lot of people definitely lose a bit of street cred for that because a lot of people would put Plastic Ono Band above this. This is the album where John himself said he sugar coated things a little bit. This is the album where he's kind of commercialized his sound a little bit for the first time really since the breakup of the Beatles. Really, he's gone for a more sort of commercial sounding release, in an LP form at the very least. He's had all his weird experimental albums. Then he had Plastic Ono Band, and then he had this. And it's kind of like, finally we got an album from John that, will please the average kind of record buying punter sort of thing. And it's really good. It's a really good, rock solid. You don't really need me to talk about in any great detail about why this album's good. Of course, it's a great album. It's the essential John Lennon studio album. I think this is the point where he kind of showed his worth outside of very much of the Beatles, and he kind of made his imprint, and he kind of this is the album really where he sort of really showed what he's capable of outside of the Beatles. And I don't think he made really a better album than this. I think he had opportunities maybe to make something better than this, and he maybe wasn't, his heart wasn't in it. So this is really what we got, and it's a fantastic album. It's this and Plastic Ono Band are just sort of, both stunning albums really, and they're the two to really look out for John. I feel like, he was never quite as great, up until these albums, with Sometime New York City. He was never quite as great after that. But this is John in full force mode. And the thing is with this album, it's quite political. The political elements are starting to bubble up with this album. It's kind of pointing in the direction of Sometime New York City. He's starting to work his way towards that with this, I feel like. Unfortunately, quite honestly, I wish he kind of stayed away from that aspect, really, made something else. But this is fantastic. It's a fantastic album. It's got one of the best well-known songs, a song that most people are kind of sick to the back teeth of hearing, the Imagine song. But despite that, it's got some really, really good stuff, really good throughout, and it's John's best album as far as I'm concerned. It's certainly the one that I think you should have in your collection. Have Imagine and then go out and get Plastic Ono Band, and that's kind of it really for John. I think they're the two main. If you're just going to get the best of the best for John, they're the two really that you kind of maybe need to check out. And then if you want a little bit more, you want to go a bit deeper, go for Walls and Bridges. That's a fantastic one as well. But besides that, it's kind of not really quite so much as far as John's concerned. But we'll finish it. Well, we won't finish it actually. We'll finish the LPs anyway. The second to last album I'm going to be showing is on vinyl. The very final one is actually on CD. But before we get to that, let's take a look at the final vinyl record, and it's George Harrison's Living in the Material World, my second favourite solo Beatles album. Controversial choice, I'm sure many will agree. To dare to put this ahead of, All Things Must Pass, put this above, the John Lennon albums and all that kind of thing. I think this is one of the, I wouldn't say one of, I think it is the most underrated solo Beatles album of them all. I've never really understood why this album, it's never regarded as the worst or anything like that, but it's never really given out much attention, this album, I feel. I think it's very much the overlooked and one of the driving forces, behind this series, besides the weird sort of obscure, overexposed dynamic, as I was talking about earlier in the video, that they have. I wanted to highlight some of the more underrated albums, and I feel like this is the most underrated of them all. Fantastic album, really. As far as I'm concerned, this is the best thing that George Harrison did in LP form, at the very least. Better than All Things Must Pass. It's a more concise album, much better mastering this time around. Phil Spector, thankfully, I don't think he he got his grubby mitts on this one, thankfully, and it sounds all the better for it. Production's actually really fantastic on this album. It really sounds amazing in places. It's got this really kind of, you know, kind of very highly produced, but in a very good way. You know, this really amazing, sort of almost magical sounding 1970s production at places. I think he really pushed the production on this album also than other George Harrison albums. You know, it makes All Things Must Pass sound like a cassette recorded from another cassette recorded from another cassette. You know, it's sort of you know, very sort of superior in sound quality. And I think I much prefer this album. It's in terms of just the way it's all put together. You know, the sequencing I think is fantastic on this album. You know, it's got the slower George Harrison tracks, which are all, you know, you're very much aware of. You know, he does love his slower track on, you know, George Harrison, but it does have its rockier track as well, more beat tempo, you know, higher tempo tracks, and it's kind of never kind of bogs down like so many George Harrison albums do, and it just all flows very well, very, you know, concise, very well put together, you know, really solid, very enjoyable, really good, very underrated, very well produced, you know, great instrumentation on it. I think it's some of George's best songs on here. It's just a joy to listen to, really. And it's an album I'll happily play through time and time again. And it's an album that I've always, you know, always enjoyed, and I've never really felt like, you know, there's something wrong with this one. As you know, maybe this one isn't as good as I thought the last time I listened to it. I always felt like this is fantastic, you know, from beginning to end, just really, really rock solid. The best of the best that George Harrison ever released, as far as I'm concerned. So that's all. That's All Things Must Pass. That's Living in the Material World. So we'll end it on number one. You probably guess what this is. On CD, I've gone for Wings, Band on the Run. A bit of an obvious choice to a certain extent, I guess. You know, I've seen this number one on a few charts, other people's charts, and that kind of thing. But quite honestly, I can't not go for this one as number one. It really is such a fantastic album from beginning to end. You know when people say, "Oh, there's not a bad song on such and such album." This kind of album goes beyond that, really. Don't think there's a bad second on this album. It's kind of every moment of this album is it's kind of fantastic, really. And although I'm kind of a bit tired of this album, to say the least, you know, Jet and Band on the Run and all that, you know, the title track, it's not, that's only the case because it's such a great album. You know, it really is. It's sort of, I think this is the one album where, you know, a Beatle actually gets close to kind of matching the quality of, you know, the Beatles as a whole. You know, and I think as you know, obviously this isn't, you know, purely a Paul McCartney solo release, but it's Paul McCartney's the driving force behind it, and I think that's pretty impressive to make an album which is up there with the quality of all four Beatles, and it's just one Beatle on, you know, on his own, with of course Linda and Denny and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I feel like Paul very much had something to prove with this album. You know, the critics before this album were kind of on his back. Members of the band had left before you know, this album was due to be recorded. The conditions of the recording of this album went great. Paul decided to fly over to Lagos in Nigeria to film this, to record this, and you know, you add all those things together. I feel like Paul's kind of like a man on a mission with this album. He's kind of like, you know, I'm going to prove everyone, you know, what I'm capable of, and he recorded this album. It's fantastic. Even John Lennon, you know, he liked this album. You know, John Lennon is on record of liking this album. You know, that's how good it is. You know, and John wouldn't, you know, I think that's the best review this album has ever received, you know, and it or will ever receive. You know, John Lennon, to kind of him to come forward and to say, yeah, this is a fantastic album. I'm not sure if he used those words exactly, but it's that's the gist of his assessment of it. You know, I think that's the most honest review you're ever going to get, because, you know, if he didn't like it, of course he would have said so. So for him to kind of go forward and say that, I think means more than anything, quite honestly. And yeah, it's just fantastic. It's just a fantastic album. I guess a lot of you have heard it, have had a copy of it. But if you haven't, it's an essential album. You know, your 70s collection, you know, if you're into your 70s rock, into just classic rock in general, you kind of need to get your hands on this. If you're into your Beatles music, this is 100% essential. It really is. And, you know, not only is this the best, you know, Wings album, not only is this the best Paul McCartney or the best, I think this is one of the best albums just ever made, sort of generally. I think you could say the same for a few of these albums. They all are up there with the best of the best that's ever been made, really. And this is definitely one of them. And what's amazing about this album is it doesn't sound like any sort of, it doesn't obviously, it doesn't sound like a Beatles album, although it matches kind of a lot of the quality that a Beatles album has. In many ways, I feel like this is the 1970s equivalent, really, of Sergeant Pepper, although it sounds nothing like Sergeant Pepper, but it's kind of like the, you know, a different version of it, to a certain extent, you know, of that sort of caliber, really, without it being in any way sort of related. Besides, of course, Paul McCartney's involvement with it. But it, you know, it doesn't sound like anything by the Beatles. It doesn't sound like any other Wings album. It doesn't sound like any other Paul McCartney sort of project. It's kind of its own little thing, this, to a certain extent. Obviously, there's elements of other Wings material and that kind of thing, as this kind of Wings to a certain degree feel. But, you know, with this sort of Nigerian influence that it has running through it to a certain extent, it kind of gives it this little separation from everything else. And I think as well with this album, you know, with Paul, you know, recording it in Lagos, you know, which point he was mugged with, you know, he was walking around the streets with Linda, and he got mugged, and the master tapes were stolen and all that kind of thing. So there's stuff going on in the background which is kind of interesting as well. It's not just a very good album. That's kind of it. I think the stuff going on in the background is pretty interesting as well. And you know, with all that kind of going on, I think the discomforts that they went through maybe helped with this album as well. So all these kind of ingredients really put together. Because you know, Paul could have recorded this anywhere he wanted to. Really, could have recorded it in, you know, the most comfortable recording studios in the world. And you compare it to something like London Town, you know, from previous videos which I've covered. You know, Paul, I believe, was going around with, you know, the rest of the band was going around on a nice comfy boat, you know, going on this extended holiday, you know, on the run up to the creation of our album. And you know, it kind of comes across as a bit of a lame album overall. That, you know, it's not a bad album, but it's not great. And I think with this, it's kind of like, you know, they kind of went through it a little bit to record this. They went through, you know, an ordeal, and it kind of benefited them. Thankfully, you know, there was nothing, nobody got hurt or anything like that. So it was kind of they went through it to create some real magic. It was like catching lightning in a bottle to a certain extent. This album, I don't think Paul could ever replicate this album, even if he tried, as talented he is, of course. So yeah, stunning album, absolutely must buy if you haven't done so already. You know, a true all-time classic, one of the best of the best, and it's my number one. I think it'll always remain my number one. I think the idea of Paul releasing an album that's better than it, I kind of hope that he does, quite honestly. It'd be amazing if he did. I kind of doubt he will, but I think that's the only chance that has of ever being dislodged from the number one solo Beatles album. So yeah, that'll do it for this time around. Kind of glad I managed to make it under the 50-minute mark. The previous attempt was over 50-minute mark, I guess because I was rambling on maybe a little bit too much in places. But there we go. Hopefully you don't disagree with my options too much, and you don't want to crucify me on the top of Mount Solo Beatles, which, you know, you're quite welcome to do, because you know, you'll have a job, because it doesn't actually exist. I kind of made it up. So anyway, next time around in the next video, it's going to be a Solo Beatles free zone, which I'm kind of very, very pleased to announce, because yeah, I'm kind of tired of the Solo Beatles, quite honestly. At this point, I'm kind of over that hill. But I think what I'm going to start doing now is, so I might bring these albums out again and go through them again in the future. Don't worry, it's not going to be anytime soon. And I might offload some of the ones that I kind of don't really enjoy all that much, and I'm kind of looking at you. Sometime New York City. I might kind of, if anyone wants a copy of Sometime New York City, just contact me and I'll give you the address of eBay, which you'll find lots of other copies you can get your hands on for, I'm sure, affordable price. But anyway, that's enough of me rabbiting on and extending this video any longer than it needs to be. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you again soon.